Hi, I'm Dwayne Menezes. I'm the founder and managing director of Polar Research and Policy Initiative, a London-based international think tank dedicated to Arctic, Nordic, North Atlantic, North Pacific and Antarctic security. I was delighted to be here largely to talk about Australia's growing footprint, economic and political, in the Arctic, but also Australia's interests and capabilities in the Arctic. We know very much about Australia's territorial claim in Antarctica, 42% of the continent's landmass. What we forget is Australia is not just an actor connected to allies in the north, like the US and Canada, but also it has a large and growing presence. If you look at the mining sector, 6 mining companies in Greenland are Australian. You look at Alaska, 9 mining companies in Australia, in the very least, 9 mining companies in Alaska are Australian. Look at Canada, over 30 mining companies are Australian. In the north, over 15. The same, Sweden, 13. Let's move over from mining. Let's look at energy. If you look at Alaska's North Slope region, about 6 companies in the oil and gas space in Alaska's oil-rich fields in the north are Australian in origin, Australian by financing. Look at tourism. So the biggest sources of tourists in Alaska, possibly the largest source of incoming tourists in Alaska, tend to be Australian. What does this mean? What if there is a cruise ship disaster and Australians are involved? What if there is an oil spill, and again it's an Australian commercial concern involved? What if there's search and rescue needed and there are Australian lives involved? What if we look at mining and there's a mining disaster and again Australian operations involved? What if there are security threats like rising Chinese influence manifesting itself through Australian vehicles, Australian commercial vehicles? Again, there's an Australian concern. Can Australia sit back and say, the Arctic is really, really far away, so we are not going to be very much engaged or invested? Or when Australia has such a gigantic economic footprint in the north, must Australia at least have a cohesive and sensible strategy and domain awareness of the region with the understanding of what Australia's roles, interests and capabilities are? One is, of course, the rising influence of China. This is undoubtedly the one topic that we can't get away from in any discussion about the Arctic or the Antarctic. And even in a discussion about Australia's interests in the Arctic, the question of Chinese influence does arise, given that Chinese companies are very often using Australian vehicles to enter some Arctic countries. Number 2 would be the threat posed by Russia. This is a slightly more traditional threat. It's more of a revived threat as opposed to a new one. Again, with Russia and China both, there's sort of constant flouting of international law, coupled with a general sentiment in the Arctic, which is that, well, they're not breaking rules yet, and they are abiding by the current system, which is good and which is to be welcomed, and they are to be complimented on it. But it does not take away from the fact that the other allied countries need to be aware and prepared for any volte-face in any of their positions. The third one, I'd say, is resource extraction. This obviously has concerns both for the Arctic and the Antarctic, and it's where the other countries have started, the reason why the other countries are taking interest, whether it's mining or oil and gas or even the move to renewable energy. This transition to a green energy revolution we all talk about and welcome and celebrate requires mining rare earths. But much of the world's rare earths come from China. The production, the control, the supply is all Chinese. So unless you want to be completely dependent on China, the only way to get rare earths breaking that monopoly is if Australian companies that are in the rare earth space begin to find alternative sources of finance and alternative places to extract rare earths. The Arctic becomes extremely strategically important here, given that the Arctic has some of the largest deposits of rare earths in the world. Again, this is why Australian companies need to make sure they don't become fronts for Chinese interested firms, yes. So I think one thing that did emerge in this conversation that I really quite enjoyed is what Christian Lubrecht mentioned about the need, perhaps, of a greater polar consciousness. Now think about it this way. If you look at Antarctica, Australia exercises 42% of a territorial claim. New Zealand say another 15%. The UK maybe 8 to 12 or 15%. Between Australia, New Zealand and the UK, three very close historic and present allies, that's over 65% of Antarctica, 60 to 70% of Antarctica under three allied claimants. Can we work together in the Antarctic space through the rise of this more pervasive Antarctic consciousness, and then using our allied resources and intelligence networks and security cooperation in the greatest interest of the region's governance and the protection of the rule of law, as we have new powers coming in that may or may not respect the rule of law locally. Say with the Arctic, the US and Canada have almost half, or perhaps more than half, of the Arctic space. Both are part of the Five Eyes network with Australia, New Zealand and the UK. Again, can we work more closely with the US and Canada to make sure we protect our security interests in the Arctic? So the big message I'm going to make here, or rather I've got from this conference, is perhaps we need to start thinking about the creation of a polar consciousness that builds on an Arctic regional consciousness and an Antarctic regional consciousness, and then to understand the roles of our Five Eyes actors within both realms of consciousness, and use that as the basis for greater Five Eyes intelligence, defence and security cooperation in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. That would be the geostrategic futures that we ought to be thinking about.